Morning. My name is Janet Gray, and I have been attending Hope for about 5 years now. So let's please stand for the reading of God's Word. The passage today is found in the book of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 13. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Well, not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a very far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. This is the word of the Lord. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Janet. Thank you. You may be seated. Could you turn to someone and say good morning, please, around you? Tell them that you are praying for fall, right? It's so good to see you. Hey, I hope you have had a great 4th of July week celebrating with family and friends. We are glad that you chose to worship with us here at Hope Fellowship this morning. So we want to continue today in our series called Parables. And Janet just so capably read the parable that we're going to talk from today, and that is the parable that we know of being the prodigal son or the prodigal. So I've called this today the reckless father. And you say, but Mark, sort of you got that mixed up, right? It's the reckless son. Well, allow me to sort of give you some definition to that title in just a few moments as we work through this text together. So I want to jump right in because there's a lot to this story. There's a lot to this narrative that I would love to share with you. So if you'll give me some moments to do that, that would be amazing. So I want to start for context back in verse 1 of Luke chapter 15 for a moment. So let me to read Luke chapter 15, verse 1. It says this, now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him. Let me pause for a point. I love this text. It's always been, Luke 15 and 1, it's always been one of my favorite scriptures out of the entire Bible, because what it always reminds me of is if you invite Jesus to speak, be careful. He will show up with his friends. He will. Who are his friends, right? Tax collectors and sinners. I love that text. And it goes on to say in verse 2, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So for clarity, Luke chapter 15, a chapter which contains 3 parables. 1, the parable of the lost sheep. 2, the parable of the lost coin. And then the third, which we're going to be talking from this morning, the parable of the prodigal. But collectively, if you look at Luke chapter 15, in essence, they are all connected. When Jesus finishes the parable of the lost sheep, he uses the word or. He connects it to the next one, which is the parable of the lost coin. And then when he starts that of the parable, which we're talking about this morning, the prodigal, he starts to simply, and he said, showing that all 3 of these are responses to a statement or a question made by the Pharisees and the scribes regarding Jesus' attitude towards sinners is what it is. So I start with the question which kind of gets our mind going this morning and our hearts connected is this. How does God feel about us when we sin? How does God feel about us when we sin? Because that is a question we have all had, because we are all humans in the room today, and we are all capable and have the propensity to sin. So we've all had this thought, how does God feel about us when we sin? But I love the parables because God makes these very personal for you and I. He starts, in fact, the first parable out by saying, what man of you? Or really what it means is, suppose one of you. So he says this to us to make it very personal so we can connect to it. He says, suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one. Or suppose one of you has 10 coins and loses one. Or suppose a father loses a son. Those hearing the parable were meant to connect to the value of loss that we find in those parables as Jesus speaks them. How would you respond to those things? How would you respond if you were a shepherd and you lost one sheep? How would you respond if you had 10 valuable coins and you lose one? How would you respond if you were a parent and you are losing a son? So it becomes very personal to you and I. in my thinking, those that are listening, including that of the Pharisees and the scribes, that they would have said, oh yeah, I would recover the lost sheep. No doubt, I'll recover the lost coin, even if it means tearing the house apart to find it, right? I'm going to recover that as well. And recovering the lost son, which is actually a parable within this whole, I think, 3 parables, which is that one is questionable. And I will talk about that in just a moment. But I think what Jesus does, he not only appeals to their understanding, but in these parables, he appeals to their emotions as well, because they're meant to feel the value of the loss of a sheep or that of a coin or that of a child as well. So in this parable we call the prodigal, there are 3 characters in the drama. There is the father, there is the younger son, and then there is the older brother, the older son. So today we'll only cover that of the father and the younger son, later on the older brother. But there's 2 things about this text that I want to point out to you. I think it helps you to frame it properly. The first is this: the main character of the story is not the prodigal. The main character of the story is not the prodigal. In fact, the main character of the story of this one parable is the father. If you go back and look at the 2 parables prior to this, then what we realize is that the main character of that of the lost sheep is the shepherd, not the sheep that was lost, because it's his response to the loss. And that of the woman and the coin, it's not the coin that was lost, but it's about the woman who tears her house apart to find the coin. So the main character of that parable is that of the woman and not the coin. So it simply rings true that it would be the same thing about this parable as well, that the main character is the father, not the wayward son. And the second is this: the word prodigal, how do I say that word, right? The prodigal son. The word prodigal is most of your translations, if you read your translation, prodigal is not found in there, is it? It's not there. It's not there. Why? Can I tell you why? Because in verse 13, he talks about his lifestyle being reckless. That is actually the word for prodigal. Right there is the word reckless. Why? Because prodigal does not refer to him being a runaway. The word prodigal means that it is his lifestyle. It is his reckless lifestyle and his wasteful lifestyle that he lives when he is away from the Father. So I think that helps us to frame some as we teach through this parable this morning. So it's Luke chapter 15, verse 11. It says this: and again he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. There's the word prodigal right there, the reckless living. So the first of 2 thoughts this morning is this: what we see as freedom may not be freedom at all. What we see as freedom may not be freedom at all. And I think this is so perfect for this being the end of the 4th of July week for you and I, as this is about freedom. We celebrate this, and as Sam just so well communicated to us in our generosity time this morning about freedom, that what we see as freedom is not, it may not be freedom at all in our lives. I think it's true for the prodigal. That's true for you and I as well. So, I'm a child of the 70s, right? Anybody else a child of the 70s? Anyone else grew up kind of in the 70s? Good. The 70s had the best music of all eras. Isn't that true? Yes, can I get an amen on that? Can you say amen to that? I don't know. I don't know if you can or not, right? Yes. But to me, all right, it was the best. I still listen to it. To me, it's great music as well. And in the 70s, we were sort of left over from the 60s, right? So I was sort of a leftover hippie from the 60s. And so I had, I had real long hair, and I had the bell bottoms as well. My bell bottoms were so big you couldn't see my shoes. They completely covered the shoes. And I also wore, because it was a little more on the disco age as well, so I also wore the real tight silk shirts with the collar unbuttoned, or the shirt unbuttoned like down to here, right? And the big collars out here. Does anybody remember those? Yeah, it's awful, isn't it? It's shameful, isn't it? It's terrible. Yes, I know, right? Yes. But we were, in that era, we were still about the whole thing about freedom, being free from society, being free from these prescribed ideas that people wanted to put us in our boxes kind of thing. And so it was all about freedom. Everything was about freedom as well. Yes, and I thought so well to go along with this because what we see as freedom may not be freedom at all. Let me share with you a little bit about this story. The younger son, he says to his father, and I think this is astounding. He says to his father, "Give me what is due to me upon your death." But he wants it now. The problem is Dad's not dead, right? So that's a real issue. What he's really saying, if you break it down, he's saying to his dad, "I wish you were dead so you could give me all of your inheritance, but just go ahead and give it all to me right now while you're alive. Give me your share, give me my share of my inheritance." How would you handle a child like that, right? How would you handle a kid like that in your own home? You might want to administer the right hand of fellowship to their seat of understanding. That's what my dad always said, right? Yes, exactly. Yeah, and it does actually make them smarter sometimes. Now, I'm not telling you how to discipline your kids, so you pray and you allow God to direct you in that area. Yes, but the Pharisees that were listening, man, it sets their ears on edge. I'll tell you why. Because he has this rebellious son, and this is not a one-off, I think, moment of rebellion with this child. This is an attitude that he has. So it sets these Pharisees' ears on edge because of the book of Deuteronomy chapter 21 in verse 18. Can I tell you what the book of Deuteronomy says about how to deal with this kind of child? Here's what it says. "If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them," some of you are saying, "Oh, I can feel that," right? "Then his father and his mother shall take hold of him, bring him out to the elders of the city at the gate of the place where he lives, and they shall say to the elders of the city, 'This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones.'" Some of you are thinking about that being your devotion tonight with your children, right? Yes. It will definitely give them great dreams. I am quite sure of that, right? But I want to say to you, this is important in understanding the father's response. Remember, the main character of this story is the father. And then, if that were not enough, in Jewish culture, there was this ceremony called the kazaza. The kazaza was a ceremony that if you had a wayward child like this, that you would bring the community together. They would bring a big clay pot, and they would break the pot there in front of the child. And what it meant separation. And it means that not only was the community separating themselves from this child who was rebellious, but yet also the parents and the family were separating themselves from the child. And so I think it's another point that we have to understand in really relating to what the father is doing here. So here's the thought. When you read the word reckless that's in this chapter, in this parable, especially how as it appears here in the prodigal's parable, when you read the word reckless, I think it equally describes, yes, the son's behavior and the way he treats his father, but it also equally describes the father's reaction to the son, because in culture at this point, the father's love for the child and his reaction to his rebellion was absolutely reckless. It was reckless. The father's love for this rebellious son culturally would have been seen as absolutely reckless in nature, completely countercultural. It would have been. The father had every right to invoke the book of Deuteronomy. He had every right to call a kazeza, to bring the community leaders together and to cut this child off. Everything he did that, even to the point of stoning him. Yet the father, he assumes for the son this portion of loss on his behalf and shame by by granting the son's request and giving him his inheritance. What I see here is this amazing view of the gospel. I see that how God has dealt with you and I in the middle of our sin and our brokenness and our rebellion toward God. Did God give us what we deserve? No, he did not. God gave us life. He gave us life. Did God give us some freedom in this world as well to find him and discover him on our own? Or did he force us to love him? He gave us the freedom to love him through our own hearts and our own minds and our own lives. It's a powerful story of the gospel. It is. You said, but Mark, wait, the Son did whatever he wanted to do. I think we have to give this some thought for a moment. He was free from the Father's house, but was he free from the Father? It's a thought. He was free from the Father's house, but was he ever really free from the Father? Because what we have here, I think, is a case of both perceived freedom and that of misused freedom as well. So let me talk to two people in the room for a few moments. And it's this: to those who are not walking with Christ today, or you're struggling with your relationship with the Lord this morning, when you look at this story, then where is the greatest act of compassion in this story? Where's the greatest act of compassion in this story? And I think historically, as we have heard it taught over the years, and if this is the first time that you have heard the story of the prodigal, then listen, man, I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad this is the first time you're hearing it. But where is the greatest act of compassion in this story? And I think we would perhaps historically say, oh, it's the prodigal son's return to his father's house and his restoration. That is, but equally, could it not be the next as well? Could it not be the father's actions in releasing the son with his inheritance? If you look at the book of Deuteronomy, if we realize this ceremony of Gazaza, if we look at those things and we lay it over what the father has done, I would say that they're probably perhaps equal in both being this amazing act of compassion on behalf of the son. Because the father had all rights to have him stoned, all rights to cut him off. But the father, as the offended member of this relationship and what is happening in this parable, covers the shame of his rebellious son. In fact, I think he does more than cover the shame of his rebellious son. He carries it. Why do you say, Mark, he carried it? Because as he's standing, as he would be a member of the community, and it says that perhaps it leads us to believe that they were a wealthy family in the community, as a story is being told by Jesus, that he had a reputation in the community, and what he had been seen by of others in the community is that of he was being accommodating of rebellious behavior by his son. He would be setting a bad example for other parents and younger parents as well in the way that he dealt with his wayward son. He carries the shame of this. The father was reckless with his love and mercy at his own expense. I think the Pharisees would have seen him perhaps in this story as they were listening. They would have said, oh, wait a minute, this father's a weak father. He's accommodating this son in his own behavior. He's perpetuating this kind of rebellion in his son's life. He's out of step with the law, and we know what the law says, how he should deal with this. So I ask a question, then, was the prodigal ever actually free from the father's love? And I think the answer to that for you and I, as we look at this story, is no. This is reckless love and grace outside of the paradigm of their culture, is what it is. The Pharisees, as they listened, and the scribes would have struggled. They would have struggled with this kind of reckless love and grace being portrayed in this story. They would have struggled with that. Why? Because their response would have been the law, which they felt like would have been the right way to deal with this child. They would have said, yes, recover the sheep that's gone from the fold. Yes, find the coin. But this rebellious son should be dealt with as the law prescribes for him to be dealt with. If you're going to release him in death. Let's stone him or separate him from his community. But what does the father do? The father releases with a leash. You say, Mark, I've read the story. I don't see the word leash anywhere, right? But he does. He releases with a leash in his son's life. Yes, because he gives him freedom with provision. Understand this. He could have just released him and pushed him out of the house and gave him nothing to live on. He could have done that, but he gave him freedom with provision in his life. the son doesn't deserve it. Listen, you can't run from that kind of love. It's unexplainable. It doesn't fit into the law. It doesn't fit into logic, does it? It doesn't fit into good understanding or parenting skills. It just doesn't seem to fit, is what he does. But he releases him with provision. It's a love with a leash. You can't get away from it. You might run from the Father's house, but not his reckless love. That's powerful. It is. So how does this relate to you and I? Oh, there are times in our lives, maybe we don't say it, but we live like it. And we say, God, listen, I don't want your lordship, and I don't want your authority over my life, right? I don't want to surrender these things in my life. I don't want to surrender the sin that I enjoy doing. I don't want to surrender these relationships which are not helpful and edifying to me, God. And I don't want you in that place and in that position in my life, God. And so we simply say, no, God, I don't want that. And God, I know better. And so what we do, we set ourselves up as our own gods. I think that was the story of the prodigal son. That you can run from God in disobedience, but it's impossible to separate yourself from his reckless love. The Father's love is expressed so strongly in this parable. The few verses that we've already read, it's a love that you can't shake, that you can't get away from. Why? Because the son knows the book of Deuteronomy, right? He knows Jewish tradition as well. He understands the things that should have happened to him, yet what he walks away from is with his inheritance and not just being separated from the family with no provision for his life. It's a love that you can't shake. The Father's love is demonstrated in that he releases his son, but he releases him with a leash. Wow. Can I give you a spoiler alert in the story? It's verse 20, and it says about the son, and he arose and came to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, ran and embraced him and kissed him. Why do you put that verse there, Mark? Why couldn't you save it for later? Because the father had been waiting for him, because the father's love had never diminished for the son. And because there was never any diminishing love on the part of the father, the son was never free from his father's love. Wow. In our national anthem, part of the words, it says that we live in the land of the free. I say this with great respect in this room this morning, and I'm so thankful for the freedom that we have to just come and worship together as we are today without fear of any retribution. But let me tell you, that freedom is an illusion. It is an absolute illusion to millions and millions of people today, because they find themselves enslaved in their own sin, enslaved in their own desire. And also the fact is that they are never free from the love of God, that nothing you can do and no how far you can go, you will never be able to shake this kind of love. It's unexplainable. The Father refuses to cut us off. He refuses to give us what we deserve. Romans 5:8 says, but God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. His love is like a great leash that we cannot shake, even though God has given us freedom, that we cannot shake that. Let me read another part of this story to you. It's verse 14. It says, and when he had spent everything, speaking of the prodigal son, and when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And as he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything, but when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. You said, but he has a good memory. He just remembers the things about his father's house. Listen, now, there's been a lot of time that has gone by. There's been a lot of wine, women, and song that's gone through his life at this point. He's applied for a job working for a Gentile as a good Jewish boy. He's working for a Gentile on a pig farm. He's a young man that would never touch bacon, but yet he's working on a pig farm as well. And the father is constantly tugging that leash with his reckless love for him. So, to another group of people in the room this morning, to those who are walking with Christ, imperfectly, yes, but those who are walking with Christ, it's Galatians 5 in verse 1. For freedom, Christ has set us free. That you are free in Christ, yes. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. That you've been freed from something to something else. We say that a lot here to you on a Sunday morning. Let me say it one more time, that you've been freed from something to something else. What are you saying, Mark? There is a meaning to the freedom that God has given you. Understand that. And it's not a license for you to just do what pleases you at the expense of what pleases the Father. That's not what this freedom is about. No, the prodigal, in the way he lived his life, that's exactly what he thought. But what he didn't realize, I think, maybe didn't think through, is the very freedom that he had to go off with his father's inheritance was a gift from God itself. That all of life is lived through the hands of God. So you've been freed from being your own God. I think that's what he thought. He thought, listen, that I know better for my life. I know better than the Father. I know what I want, and here's what I want. And so what I realized that when God brings freedom in our life, we're freed from being our own God. You say, I've never heard anybody say that. I know, but we're surrounded by people that live like that. And there's some of you in this room this morning that live like that as well. And you place this impossible weight upon your life because if you are being your own God, then you have to have answers for all the hard questions in life. And that is, why does good people suffer? What is your answer for that? Or other questions like, what is your purpose in life? You got to have an answer for that one. Also, did Adam have a belly button? You got to have an answer for that, right? Yes, you do. Those are complex questions. What has Christ freed us to is the question. Paul's answer is he's freed us to freedom. Well, freedom to what? Well, I began to think about that. So I read through that chapter in the book of Galatians. And look, here's what it says in chapter 6. Only faith working through love, he says. And then he says again in 13 that through love serve one another. And then in 14 he says, for the law is faithful in one word, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And I began to put all this together. And what I realized that we've been freed to love. Why? Because when we love to do something, we don't need to be commanded to do that. And so as I am loving God and God is loving me, then it frees me to simply live by the commands and the guidelines of God. So I'm not my own God. I don't know what's best for my life, but He does. So verse 19 says, that I am no longer worthy, going back to Luke 15, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion, ran, embraced him, and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. You see, the prodigal could have left the pig field and gone anywhere. He could have gone anywhere. But this just kind of came to me this week, and I wrote this in my journal because I wanted to say it to you the right way. And what I realized about the prodigal, the younger son, is that it was the love of the father for his servants that drew him back home. You see, let me say it again. It was the love of the father for his servants that drew him back home. If you go back and read the text that we just read just a moment, that's exactly what it is. Why? Because he had already resigned that he was no longer a son. He might be son by birth, but he could no longer live in the house as a son, is what he's saying. So he was thinking that a kezazah had already happened on his behalf, and he had been separated from his father and his family and his community. So he wants to come back because he knows the character and the nature of the father, and he knows how well he treats his servants. So not that coming back living like a son, but he could come back living like a servant. So it was the love of the father for his servants that brought him home. It was the character and the nature of his father. That's why so many times that we teach on the character and nature of God. We don't always give you the 3 steps to a happy life and those kinds of things. And I'm not saying that those sermons are wrong within themselves. But what I realize that when life kind of falls out from under you and when the carpet is kind of removed from under your feet, then if you can fall back on knowing the character and the nature of God, then it gives you a firm foundation when things are not going right in your life. So he cares for his servants, and even if I'm a servant, I'm better off than where I am, because this thing of me being my own God has not worked out really well for me, right? So the last thought this morning is this of request denied. I mean, there are times when God says no, and this is one of those moments when God says no. The request of the son to the father was that he work off the debt. He would work off the debt, and then possibly at some point in the far future, then he could be restored as a son in his father's house, and he could live like a son. He says, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. He wasn't talking about his son at birth, but he was talking about the position in which he lived in the house at prior to him leaving in rebellion, is what he's saying. So I'll just work this off, God. I'll just, as we say to God sometimes, he would probably have to say to his father, I'll just work this off as a servant, and I'll pay you back. But look at verse 22. It says, but the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son, not a servant, but this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they begin to celebrate. The request of the son to come back and just be a servant was denied, not because of the impossibility of the debt, but because of the heart of the father. He says, for my son was dead and now he's alive. He's lost and he's been found. What is our natural reaction to God when we sin against him? God, forgive me. Then what? God, I'll make this up to you, God. I'll work this off, Lord. I'll make this right. I will. And here's what God says, as the Father said to the Son. God says to us, request denied. Request denied. The prodigal was not the only reckless one in this story, but it was the reckless love of the Father for the Son, for whom his first act in the Son's life, first act of love, was to give him freedom, but to not withdraw his presence from him. That's a love you can run from, but you can't run out of. Oh. I think in having an understanding of this freedom that the Father gave the Son with provision, reminds us in even a greater way of the reckless love of God for our lives. It surpasses maybe good parenting skills. It surpasses what we might consider to just make good sense at times. It's his reckless love for us. That there are times when he gives us freedom to find him for ourselves and to not force us into a love relationship with him. So if you were to open Webster's dictionary and look under the phrase, those that run from God, then probably a lot of your photos would be in there, right? Or have run from God. And then also, I would be there with you. Because I think I connect so much with this story because I experienced that freedom and love that God gave me to find him for myself, but he never removed his presence from me. For years, I ran from God. And I thought I could outrun his love. And what I realized after an extended period of time of doing that, that the more I ran, just the longer the leash became. And God relentlessly tugged on the leash in my life for years. I was miserable, and I think my goal in life was to make everybody around me miserable as well, and I think I succeeded. I was at college and met this beautiful young lady by the name of Reba. I've told you this before, that she wouldn't let me date her unless I went to church with her. And so I went to church with her one Sunday. And man, I was so miserable that morning. I can remember where the church was. It was a church right off the campus where I was at college. And I remember sitting there. I couldn't tell you what the pastor preached on. But I can remember that morning so much that I felt like that not only was Jesus pulling on the leash, but he had the Father and the Holy Spirit as well, just yanking it hard that day. And I remember that as the pastor stopped preaching, as he said those famous words of all preachers, and in closing, which we know means nothing, right? Yes, yeah. That I knew I had to do something with my life. And so when he asked people to pray, that day I prayed. And I surrendered my life to God. By the way, I got the girl in the end too, so that's good, right? Yeah. And now here we are, 3 sons later, 2 amazing daughter-in-laws, 4 grandchildren. 45 years later, this coming August. But all of that started back at the Father's house. And for those of you this morning that are running in disobedience with God, ignoring his voice in your life. What you are living in is a perceived freedom. It's not really freedom at all. Because freedom is only found at the Father's house. Only there. And maybe you're afraid to go back. You're afraid what the Father will say to you and what punitive act that will be dealt out to you in your life. I want to say to you, go home and read this parable again. That's not the way it ends. That's the way the prodigal thought it would end. And to him, that would have been good enough. But yet the way it ends is restoration, redemption, freedom. You see, I don't know your hearts, but God does. God does. And you can waste years perhaps running from him, or you can hear the story today of the prodigal and come to the Father's house. He loves you with a reckless love that in human standards makes no sense. But that's the love of the Father. So can I pray with you for a moment? Would you just find a posture of prayer for yourself today, however that looks for you? Whether you are bowing your heads or closing your eyes, or just sitting there and letting just opening your heart and allowing the Holy Spirit to speak to you. Those that are joining us online, that you would pray with us as well. So, Father, here we are as your children. That we were the lost sheep that you left the fold and rescued. We are the coin that was lost, and you turned heaven and earth upside down for us. We are the prodigal, the one that is rebellious, that has said things to you, God, that perhaps we should have never said. Yet, it did not diminish one minuscule portion of your love for us. That God, you went against everything to love us. Your love is absolutely reckless for us. So, Lord, meet us as you always do, exactly where we are on our journey. For those in the room that are running, God, you're tugging the leash today. For those that are uncertain about your response in them returning to the Father's house, may they hear the truth this morning and not a lie of the enemy. That we are sons and daughters. Father, for the lie the enemy tells us that we're living in freedom because we're able to do whatever we want to fulfill our own desires. God, dispel that lie with truth today. That only only freedom is in you. For those moments that we've misused our freedom and forgotten that it was given to us to love, forgive us. Meet us where we are. May today be a moment that we return to the Father's house. Father, we thank you for meeting us here today. In your name.
Hey, thanks for joining us today and spending this time with us. Before you leave, would you take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel or go on Facebook and comment there so that more people will have the opportunity to hear this message. Also, if you'd like to further engage, go to our website at hopeandanderson.com and subscribe to our newsletter as well. We'd love to see you on campus sometime. Our services are at 9 and 11 a.m. and we would love to have you here in person. So again, thanks for your time and have a great day.